Hello, Sonia.
Hi, how are you today?
Good. So we just wanted to start by welcoming our guests and welcome to our third virtual online session for the custom election code for, sorry.
Yeah, it's not even a
Um,
proposed code yet. We're just creating it still.
yeah, so
So today we are going to be talking about what Witset members would like to see in the custom election code around the boundaries of chief and councillor duties and responsibilities. So what are the chief's responsibilities? What are the responsibilities of a councillor? If there are some things that should be only done by the whole of council, maybe there's certain things that the whole of council is responsible for example, decision making, and other things that maybe, for example, if you have a youth counselor, maybe the youth counselor has specific responsibilities assigned to them that align with their particular role as a youth counselor, that type of thing. And then the second topic that we will be talking about today will be council remuneration. So what types of honorarium or salary, and how should decisions about that be made for chief and council? So what you can see on the screen right now is a kind of just topic heading, and the presentation times are incorrect because these are the same slides that we're going to use for the full day meetings. So I didn't update the slides or change them for today's meeting. And what we're going to talk about are the duties and responsibilities of chief and council. And the way that we're going to go about doing that is, first, I will go over some of the existing laws and policies that apply to chief and council and the boundaries of what their responsibilities are. And then we will talk about what you would like to see in the custom election code about their responsibilities, in addition to the things that are already set out in other laws. For example, there's financial administration law, the Indian Act, different laws talk about the responsibilities of council, and some of them talk about the responsibilities of the chief, some of them talk about the responsibilities of the council as a whole. We will not need to repeat those things in the custom election code, but there may be additional things you want to have in there or clarifications around the boundaries of the roles of chief and council. So I will go into some information now about what the sources are of where council gets their power and authority. And before I continue on, is there a little box in the corner of my screen right here with your faces on it that you can see, or is that hidden from you?
it's hidden.
Okay. Okay, because then I can see your faces, but then it's not on the screen. Perfect. I just wanted to make sure of that.
So
Okay.
are these slides on those papers that you guys gave us from the meeting?
They are not, but if you want to plop your email address into the chat box, Lacey can send you an email with the slides. And copies will be printed out as well pretty soon. Lacey will be organizing a table at the band office as well soon, where there'll be copies of documents. So anybody who lives in Witset should be able to go to the band office and get all the documents from all the meetings.
Are these documents the PDFs on the website?
Nope, those are different attachments. So Dale, after we're done all of our virtual sessions, Dale will post copies of all the slides onto the website. But
Okay.
if you want a copy now, Lacey can send you in an email. So just plop your email address in for her and she can send it to you. Okay, so we have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act that talks about Indigenous governance, and it does not use the word band or First Nation. So when we're looking at the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, it sets out things that Indigenous governing bodies can do. For example, it sets out that an Indigenous governing body can enter into an agreement with the province to what they call exercise a statutory power of decision jointly. For example, that would have to do with a provincial law where the province has to make a decision and the Indigenous community wants to jointly make that decision with the province. For example, it might have to do around a permit for drawing water out of the river, right? Then an Indigenous governing body can enter into an agreement with the province around shared decision-making for whether or not to give out a permit, for example, to draw water out of the Bulkley River in the territory there, right? But the band, again, is not an Indigenous governing body. So for this, the band and council to do anything in that respect, it would need to be designated by Witset people to be the Indigenous governing body that is acting on behalf of Witset members. And this is something that also could be done with the Office of Wet'suwet'en and the hereditary chiefs. The hereditary chiefs could be the Indigenous governing body instead. So in past meetings that we've had discussions around the structure of chief and council, there was a lot of talk from Witset members about how Witset needs to align what it puts into its election code with the hereditary system and with our own Wet'suwet'en laws. And so this is an area where it's possible that Witset does not end up taking on responsibility, but it's an area where it could happen. Then there is the Act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. And under that legislation, basically what it says is that an Indigenous governing body, which could be a council, a government, or an other entity, so a band council, band government, or other entity, which could be created by the band, maybe a society, for example, is authorized to act on behalf of an Indigenous group, community, or people who hold for rights under the Constitution Act, Section 35 rights. So basically under the Act respecting First Nations, Inuit, Métis children, youth, and families, there is the ability of an Indigenous group, community, or people to create and implement their own child welfare laws. This is something that is currently being worked on by the Office of the Wet'suwet'en and the hereditary chiefs. So I won't go into any detail there. In some communities, the band council and the First Nation becomes the Indigenous group, community, or people, and they create and implement their own laws for their First Nation. But that is not happening right now with Witset. So when we're looking at powers that council currently does have, and it's very clear in the laws that they have these powers, and it's not talking about Indigenous governing body, but it's talking about an actual First Nation in these laws. The first one is the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. So that's where a First Nation can create their own financial administration laws around taxation, around local services. For example, like if they wanted to, at the band level, provide power to the community through their own company, or they wanted to provide services of snow removal, etc. They could create their own laws around where the money comes from to do that, taxation of members to do that type of thing. And of course, if there's people who are leasing land on the reserve, not people who own CPs, but maybe they're leasing land as a company, then those companies could be taxed similar to a property tax off reserve through taxation laws that are created under the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. And so this is basically where council can create laws around financial administration. Under the Family Homes on Reserve and Matrimonial Real Interests Act, that's another federal law. And so subject to member approval, a First Nation through that law can make its own laws that apply to the separation of assets. So the separation of real property, which means any houses or land or anything that's permanently affixed to land on the reserve, when somebody is in a relationship with a person who's not a member and then they separate. So, or they're in a relationship with somebody who's not a member and then they pass away. So this allows First Nations to create their own laws around the division of property, real property. So mostly this would apply to homes on the reserve in the event that a non-member is otherwise entitled to a portion of it. So it could override some of the rules in the Indian Act around estates is the biggest impact that type of a law would have. Now, council does not have authority to do this without member approval. Members would need to be involved and ratify that law and approve it, but council, of course, has the authority to lead a process to go down that road with community if they want to. The same thing with regards to the Framework Agreement on First Nations Lands Management Act. Canada, through that law or act, same, but different. So through the Framework Agreement on First Nations Lands Management Act, the First Nation can create its own land code, which would override all the rules in the Indian Act around the use, possession, and occupation of reserve lands that belong to that First Nation. Now, council can make a resolution by band council resolution saying that there's a minimum % of eligible voters who have to participate in the ratification vote for that land code to come into place. They also have the power to appoint the ratification officer, and they would be helping with the process of creating a land code under that act, but they would not have the power to create the land code without community being involved and ratifying the land code to confirm they want it to override the Indian Act rules. Under the Indian Act, Section 81 of the Indian Act, council can make a lot of the same decisions as things that would otherwise be done under a land code. So this is creating bylaws, and the types of bylaws that council can make include bylaws around residency on reserve, bylaws around trespass on reserve. There's a whole list in Section 81 where council can make those without having to go to community. So I don't think there are any bylaws right now, are there, Lacey, that apply? The band has no bylaws in place?
No, the only bylaw we have currently is our dog bylaw.
Right, yeah. So animal control is a pretty popular one that communities end up using, and then community safety type bylaws. And so anyway, Section 81 of the Indian Act, council can make their own bylaws around different things around the use, possession, and occupation of reserve land. And then there is the First Nations Jurisdiction over Education in British Columbia Act. And under that act, which is also federal law, subject to community approval again, the First Nation can sign an individual agreement where it basically agrees to a funding structure for how it will provide education on reserve, and it can create its own education law that applies to things like teacher certification, the creation of schools, requirements for graduation from a school on reserve, and that only applies to any schools that are located on reserve. My understanding is that Witset is exploring that as an option to have its own education law through the Education Society, and that you may hear something about that in the future. But this is, again, a type of law council does not have the ability to make on their own without the involvement of community members. So community members have to be involved in the process, and they have to vote in favor of the law coming into effect. And then from that point forward, council may have powers under that law. So if Witset were to create any of these laws, they could set out in those laws the powers of chief and council with respect to the different topics that those laws cover. So that's something that is always going to kind of be in the background, and it shows that the custom election code is not the only way to kind of achieve some of these things. And I just wanted to give this as kind of background information there. When it comes to limits on what chief and council can do, there are a couple of things that restrict how chief and council exercise their lawmaking powers. For example, say under the Indian Act, chief and council wanted to create a law around trespass on reserve, right? we'll use that as our example as we go through the different restrictions. There is something called fiduciary duty, where when chief and council are exercising any decision making, they have to do so in the best interest of all members of Witset. They can't do it in a way that is favorable to some members and not other members. And so they have to have that in the background of their decision making, and their decisions need to be based on that at all times. And there's human rights laws that also restrict the way that chief and council make decisions. And so the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is one such restriction. And so that sets out the individual rights of people against the government, essentially. Chief and council are considered to be part of the government of Witset, the Indigenous government of Witset. And so any laws that get created would have to be compliant with individual people's rights and freedoms under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And then there's a Human Rights Act at the federal level, and that sets out also restrictions with regards to how council operate. They cannot act in a discriminatory manner. They cannot discriminate against individual band members based on ancestry, religion, age, sexual orientation, physical and mental disability. The Human Rights Act has a whole list of protected characteristics that chief and council, when they make decisions, have to respect in their decision making and in all their conduct towards membership. There's also administrative law that does limit chief and council and the way that they operate in their exercise of their duties and responsibilities. And basically, under administrative law, it says that they have to act within the boundaries of their authority. So they have to be able to point to where they have the power to do what they're doing. Where does that power come from? And they also have to make sure that they're being procedurally fair to anybody who is impacted by a decision that they are going to make. So that means that if they're going to make a decision that has a negative impact to you on a band member, for example, if they're making a decision under the housing policy on eviction, that would be an example. I don't know, Lacey, do they do the eviction decisions in Witset?
We have a policy, but we don't have a bylaw.
Yeah, so under the policy though, is it council who makes the decisions around evictions?
Yes.
Yeah, so if they were making a decision under the housing policy around an eviction, they would need to provide the person who they are intending to evict with notice about the reasons behind why they plan to do that eviction, provide that person an opportunity to be heard with regards to the proposed eviction, and then provide reasons to the person about the final decision they make around whether to evict. So that's what procedural fairness is. It's notice to know the case against you, a reasonable opportunity to be able to present to the decision maker, being council in this case, for example, around the decision that they're going to make, and then reasons for that decision that are based in the criteria set out in the housing manual for that example.
Okay.
Oh,
Sonia, I just wanted to make note that Delee has been making a lot of comments in our chat.
Okay, are they ones that we want to address right now, or?
I just wanted to make you aware of it so we can probably address it towards the end.
Okay.
Unless they pertain to the presentation currently.
Yeah, if there are questions, if there's any questions about the presentation for clarification or anything, did you want to read those ones out to me and we can go over them, or?
I think the last two comments were pertaining to the presentation.
Okay, so one of the questions, and that would be reviewed by an independent panel selected by chief and council. I saw some interesting court cases where the review panel was called to question. They basically covered everything up, whereas now ISC reviews it all, right? So there would be an authority to answer if something does go wrong. Delee, maybe you can clarify for us what the question is about, what part of the presentation?
That could be the comment that she made. She made another comment.
Oh, there's one above it.
In regards to the election code.
So if the community members agree and the Witset custom election code states that we will ensure to align with our hereditary system. And because we will be engaging in a tripartite agreement system, essentially the band could make decisions about the territories that couldn't be challenged in court. Is that what this means? I think let's come back to this after I talk about the duty to consult and the approach that the government currently takes.
Okay.
Because I'm going to share some more information about that first, and then I think it'll fit into that discussion. Okay, Dilly, we'll come back to that. So under the Witset Financial Administration Law, which was passed in 2017, council duties include responsibility for all matters about the financial administration of Witset, and chief and council, essentially not chief and council, because council is the one that passes BCRs, can establish its own policies and procedures around financial administration, including some that must be established. So here you see things that are highlighted, and so you can see they're in bold: record ownership and access to records and information technology that is used by Witset in a way that policies must ensure integrity of Witset's financial administration and database systems. So those are things that council must create policy and procedure around. The other bullet points are things that council may create policies and procedures around. So they have the discretionary power of whether or not to do that. So acquiring, managing, and safeguarding Witset assets. So that's buying, managing, and safeguarding Witset buildings, for example, lands, etc. Human resources, so dealing with the staffing at the First Nation and establishing and implementing internal controls around the management of money, essentially. Indemnities, guarantees, and loans by Witset, identification and assessment of potential fraud, and capital projects management. So indemnities in this case is where the First Nation would say, I will pay you, individual A, back if anything with regards to this project, for example, that we're working on, or with regards to your position with the band, for example. I will pay you back for any losses that you suffer financially due to your role and responsibility as a staff member, or due to, you know, the duties we've given you to do in this project. That's an example there. A guarantee is where the band would say, we guarantee to pay back this loan on behalf of this individual if they fail to pay it back. We guarantee it. So we give the bank a guarantee that they can come after us for that money if that individual person does not pay the money back. And then conditions of loans is included there as well. And then in the Witset Financial Administration Law, it also sets out a process for appointing a finance committee, and one person on that finance committee has to be a councillor. All of the people must be independent, and they also council also appoints a chair. Council can terminate the positions of members on the committee for cause, and also create their own policies and procedures that the committee has to comply with. Why is that not switching? Okay. Under the Financial Administration Law, council also has the authority to appoint the executive director of Witset and to decide the contract terms for their employment. And they also have the ability to make decisions around who the senior financial officer will be for Witset, and the terms and conditions of their employment, and the tax administrator of Witset and the terms and conditions of their employment. However, the senior financial officer and tax administrator, they report to the executive director. Council only oversees executive director position. They are not able to direct or make decisions about the employment of anybody below the executive director in accordance with the way this works here. They also need to establish and maintain an organizational chart for Witset. So that's basically, if you were to think like a genealogy chart and how people are related to each other, it would be like how different possessions within Witset are related to each other. So the top of that chart would be the chief and council. Underneath that would be the executive director. under the executive director would be the senior financial officer and the tax administrator, and then you would have all the departments there as well. Council also has duties and responsibilities to do a multi-year financial plan. Every year they have to do that for the community and create annual budgets. Make sure that there's financial statements for all spending, that there's financial statements created, and they make decisions around writing off any debts that are owed to Witset and around borrowing money and granting securities in Witset assets. So granting a security in a Witset asset means that they are saying, we are going to, for example, borrow money to build a new youth center, and we own all these vehicles already, and we don't owe any money on them. So we're going to say, if we don't pay back this loan, you can take these vehicles as security. And if we don't pay back this loan, then you can take those vehicles, seize them, and sell them to get the money back from us. So that's what that would be, using the vehicles as a security. So that's any type of property that you put up. And it could be money that's in a different account that they say you have a security on this different account of money that we have, for example. Council can also make decisions about investing Witset financial assets, and then if there's some responsibilities as well to community members here, where the council has to post a public notice of meetings, that if there's a chief and council meeting where they're going to be looking at multi-year financial plans, annual budgets, budget deficits, the spending of extraordinary expenses, capital projects, and borrowing money for capital projects, if any of those things are going to be getting discussed at council meetings, then they're responsible to post a public notice about that before the meeting is held. And then basically they also, in addition to council duties, there's some chief specific duties in the financial administration law. And you see these section numbers here, they are sections of the financial administration law if people want to look specifically at that. And you can see, if I go back a little bit, that there's section numbers throughout the whole slide. Those are the specific wording of those sections that we're referencing. The chief signs off on financial statements for the band. It's kind of more like a formality though than anything. Under the Indian Act, the chief also has some duties and responsibilities. They are responsible for certifying land surrenders and designations. And Lacey, you had a recent designation in the community, right? That can you maybe talk a little bit about what the designation was for, so that people understand, because they were probably involved in that process?
Yeah, so the land designation was for our 26 unit apartment building. One of the requirements that BC Housing needed was for that section of land to be designated specifically for the apartment building, and that was due to the lease that needed to be put in place. And so in order to do a land designation, it had to go through a ratification process with Witset members, and Witset members needed to vote in favor of doing that land designation for that property, specifically for that apartment building. So it was interesting. That was probably the first land designation that happened in Witset since the designation that occurred for the sawmill.
So a long time then, since the last one. So that's, the chief would have a duty then just to certify that, and basically that's, you know, making sure that they're saying, yes, this process happened, here's how it went about, and they're kind of signing off on a certification of that. The chief is also an ex officio voting member of all committees, and that's set out in the Indian Band Council procedure regulations. So the chief can attend any committee meetings for all committees of Witset, and they have a vote at all those committee meetings. And I think in a lot of communities, chiefs don't even know they have this authority because they have their own policies and they just go by what their policies say. They're also the presiding officer or the chairperson of all chief and council meetings. That is also set out in the Indian Band Council procedure regulations. when it comes to the role of council and rights and title, which Dilly, your question around the use of territories, I think kind of is more structured around this piece of things. Government intends to make, so this is in situations where the government intends to make a decision that could impact the Aboriginal rights and title of Wet'suwet'en people in this circumstance, then it uses a database. It's called the Aboriginal and Treaty Rights Information System. And it's a database that's been created by government that sets out who has made a claim over that territory. And it sets out the names of everybody who has made a claim, whether or not their claim over that territory is a legitimate, valid claim. It sets that out, that they say that they have title or rights in that area. So if any Aboriginal group says they have title and rights in the area, that is in this ATRIS database. And so Witset is named in that database, right? And so is the Office of the Wet'suwet'en. I assume, I haven't seen it yet, but I understand there's also other bands that have overlapping claims to Wet'suwet'en territories that would be also included in this database. And what happens is they're put in the database, and then there's kind of a mapped area around the area that they are claiming to have rights or title in that tells the government there's a group of Aboriginal people who say they have rights or title in this area. This is, we need to now consider this when we decide to consult with Aboriginal peoples around granting permits or, selling a chunk of land that's Crown land, or any decisions around land, right? So the government, in accordance with this ATRIS system, which Witset is named in, the government may consult the Witset Council about the potential impacts of its decision on the rights and title of Witset members. It can also consult the hereditary chiefs about the potential impact of decisions on house groups. So the government could and does engage both with the band and with the hereditary chiefs, and with other First Nations that have overlapping claims. And then they do all that before they make their final decision on what to do. I have a note here, I'll make sure. ATRIS is a web-based information system that locates Indigenous nations, groups, communities, and organizations on an interactive map. It displays information about their potential or established rights and title areas. It is based on information that the federal government, so the Government of Canada, receives from Indigenous nations, groups, communities, and organizations, from agreements that they enter into, and from specific claims that are filed in the Specific Claims Tribunal in Canada. Also from comprehensive claims filed in Canada. Generally, those arise where individual rights have, so this is like claims filed, for example, in the BC treaty process, right? And self-government negotiations and court cases and decisions. So basically what happens is they go to that database, and Witset's name is in the database, and so is a whole bunch of other groups' names, depending on what territory or what parcel of land it is that they're planning to make a decision that might impact that land. And then they go about their consultation with each of those different parties, and then they make their decision. There's also a provincial policy. So sorry if I go back here, just a slide. This is all under a federal policy, and I can provide a link to the federal policy if people want that. I can send that around later if people want more detail on that. The role of council with regards to rights and title at the provincial level. So this is when the provincial government is making decisions. The provincial government has a policy. It's called the Updated Procedures for Meeting Legal Obligations when Consulting First Nations. It was created in 2010. And in that policy, it says that the provincial government must identify all First Nations that have Aboriginal interests within the area of a proposed government activity. I highlight the word First Nations because this is a different approach that the province takes than the approach that is set out in that federal policy. First Nations being bands, not being groups of Indigenous people, right? They review information to gain an understanding of the Aboriginal interests that may be impacted by their decision. So which First Nations have asserted that they have rights or title over this area we're making a decision about. And then they look at the strength of the case of the First Nation supporting the claim. So how strong is the First Nations claim over this area, right? What type of evidence might support that they have a strong likelihood that they have title or that they have rights in this area? And then they look at the potential impact on those rights. And then they determine what extent of consultation do I need to engage in? So how deep do I need to go in my work? And when they're looking at that, what they're deciding is the consultation level. Am I satisfied that this person has a really high likelihood of proving in a court that they have rights and title? If yes, then it's probably going to be deep consultation. If it's a medium chance, normal consultation. If it's a weak chance, maybe they just notify. Or maybe they say, you know, we're just giving you an opportunity to give us feedback, but this isn't going to be a bunch of meetings or anything. The level of how deep they go into their consultation changes depending on those factors around the strength of the First Nations case supporting their claim of rights and title and the potential impact that the decision the government is going to make has on those rights. So does the decision that the government is, for example, the First Nations say we have fishing rights in this area, you can't give that water license, then they also look at what is the likelihood that us giving this water license out is going to have an impact on their right to fish? Is it going to negatively impact the right to fish? And then, excuse me, I just need to get a drink. My throat is getting dry. And then they have to decide who is going to do the consultation. Is it going to be the ministry that's involved? For example, Ministry of Lands, Ministry of Agriculture, or is it going to be some other agency that's making the decision? Is there going to be an interagency team, so multiple people involved from different ministries in the engagement? And is the proponent, which is the person who's asking for the permit or the authorization from government, going to be included? For example, right now there's this BC Hydro process that's going on that the community is probably familiar with. The proponent in that case would be BC Hydro, and the ministry would be the Ministry of Lands, because they're deciding around the whether or not to give permits or right-of-ways for the additional power lines to go through, right? And then the consultation occurs, and then they discuss whether or not anything the government can do to accommodate and be able to move forward with what they're doing while not disturbing the rights or title of the First Nation. And then the government makes its final decision at the end of the day. So in this part here of our discussions, if we're to look at the questions from Delee, just let me, how did I do this? I had the questions up earlier and now I've lost them. Oh, it's too hard to have screen share. I'll come back to the question after we finish the slides then, because I can't do screen share plus that. And I'm getting pretty far along to almost being done kind of with the slides on duties and responsibilities. So in order to give a comparison to what's in the current laws of Canada and of Witset and of the province around how they treat chief and council responsibilities, we'll look at how members of the legislature of the province operate. They have parliamentary duties, so that includes making laws for the province, dealing with public expenditures and taxes and making decisions around that, very similar to the financial administration law that applies to Witset. Parliamentary oversight of government by asking questions about government plans and policy and by participating in debate. So this is when when laws and policies are being adopted, they go and debate amongst themselves and question the minority government can be questioning the majority government on what they're doing. And then they would have, similar to us having a chief, for example, and an executive directors, they have speaker, deputy speaker, assistant deputy speaker to the House. So this is just around how they manage things inside their big equivalent of what I would say is a council meeting, our small size here in the band context. And they serve on committees as well. Then they also have what's called representative duties, meeting with constituents, so meeting with members who live in the areas they represent, attending community meetings and events in those areas, and assisting people who live in the area that they represent with questions and concerns about provincial programs, policies, and benefits. And I think informally this happens probably in Witset, where chiefs and councillors meet regularly with members, attend community meetings, and help members with their questions and concerns around programs, policies, and benefits that are offered either through the band or through Indigenous Services Canada. The other things that members of legislature do is they appoint people to cabinet. So this is appointing people into ministerial roles, and which is what a cabinet position is. So for example, this is like the Minister of Forests, the Minister of Children and Family Development, that type of thing. So basically what happens is the Lieutenant Governor of BC appoints members into those roles, but they do it on the recommendation of the Premier. So if you were to look at this, like the equivalent would be the chief making those types of recommendations and or decisions. And the Premier's recommendation is based on who of the elected MLAs have the experience that they need to uphold those roles, right? And so this is kind of similar to communities and how we have often a portfolio for your chief and councillors. So this kind of ministerial roles is similar, I guess, to how portfolios are. And the Premier and all cabinet ministers, they report directly to the Executive Council. So all the MLAs get elected in, they make up the Executive Council. And then people get, out of that group of people, some people might get appointed to be ministers of government. And then the Premier and those ministers, they are responsible for always reporting back to the whole of all the people that got elected in. And then cabinet duties is basically each minister is, if you're appointed a minister, then you're responsible for making sure that certain laws that fall within your portfolio area get implemented. So, for example, the Minister of Children and Families would be responsible for the Adoption Act, the Child Families, the Ministry of Children and Family Development Act, which deals with child welfare stuff, and they need to make sure that all those things are being implemented properly. And the Premier gives each of those ministers a mandate letter that says, in doing this work, here's where I want you to prioritize your energy and time. When it comes to municipalities, there's also specific duties set out for mayors and councillors. And so just in comparison to what you might want to see for chiefs, under the community charter, which is a provincial law, mayors provide leadership to their council. They recommend bylaws and resolutions. They have to carry out duties on behalf of council. For example, they might attend ceremonies. They might attend other meetings on behalf of all of council. So they're kind of that front face of the chief of the mayor and council. They're the public face for the most part. They communicate information to council that's coming from the other areas. For example, the chief administrative officer of the city. They chair council meetings, again, very similar to what you see a chief doing. They establish standing committees and appoint people to those committees. So in this circumstance, the mayor has the sole authority to create committees and appoint people to them. It's a little bit different maybe than what you see happening already with chief and council. And they can provide general direction to municipal officers about implementing municipal policies, programs, and directions. And they can suspend municipal officers and employees in certain circumstances. In contrast, if you're only a councillor and you're not the mayor on a city council, then you have different duties. You have to consider the well-being and interests of the municipality and its community and all the work you do, and just very broad-based here, contribute to development and evaluation of the city's policies and programs, participate in council and committee meetings, and then you get other duties assigned by council. So in this case, council as a whole assigns duties to individual councillors in their work. So they might say you're going to be the person in charge of running this committee, or you're going to be the liaison to this particular neighborhood in the city. So they can kind of assign duties in that way. And then there's obviously just complying with the laws of the city and everything that you have to do. So we've come to the end of the part of our presentation that has to do with the roles and responsibilities of chief and council, the existing ones that there are now. And then the next piece is to talk about what you would like to see the responsibilities and duties of chief and council be moving forward. What should the custom election law say in it? And some Wet'suwet'en considerations to keep in mind while you think about is, what do your Wet'suwet'en legal traditions teach you about the duties of your leaders and how they interact with you about things that affect you? So when you think back about your stories from long ago, your history, Wet'suwet'en language, Wet'suwet'en law, oral traditions, what do those things say about the duties of leadership in general, and how does that inform what you want the duties of chief and council to look like in the custom election code? And then I'm just going to go into the second, let me see if there's a second question here too that. And then the next thing to think about, I'll go through this and then we'll get into our discussion. We'll jump back a slide, but just so that Dale can truncate the end of this part of the presentation. In addition to the federal laws that authorize council to do things, and in addition to Witset laws like the financial administration law that already authorizes council to do things, and in addition to policies and procedures that Witset has, for example, the housing policy that may authorize council to do things, and in addition to work that council does in response to the federal and provincial governments when they say, hey, we want to consult with you about these potential impacts on Wet'suwet'en rights and title. In addition to all those things, what else should council be authorized to do on behalf of Witset members or in relation to the needs of Witset members? I'm going to stop sharing the screen now and come back to the group here for discussion. So the next topic is going to be on council honorariums, and we have an hour allocated for this topic in our big group sessions, but we think that it will take less time in our small group session. And so basically what we're going to be talking about is how chief and council honorariums currently work, how the honorariums and pay structures work in other jurisdictions. So for example, how does a member of our provincial government's legislative assembly gets paid, our elected officials at the provincial level or the federal level or municipal level? And how do you want to see that work with regards to chief and council? So right now, this information here comes from there's a Financial Transparency Act, which is a federal law, so a Canadian law, and it requires First Nations to complete a schedule of remuneration and expenses for its chief and councillors. Remuneration in that law includes all salaries, wages, commissions, bonuses, fees, honoraria, and dividends, and any other benefits that they get reimbursement of expenses for. Expenses include transportation, accommodation, meals, hospitality, and incidental expenses. So for example, if somebody is on chief and council and they have a contract with the band to do work for the band, then they will have a higher amount of money that they've been paid because it includes their wages or the contract, right? So if people hold positions working with the band, this number includes their chief and council honoraria as well as the money that they make as an employee or a contractor to the band. And these are just for 2022-2023 year and 2021-2022 year. I did not have the 2023 to 2024 information because it had not been posted yet publicly. And so this is just to give an idea. So if you were to split these amounts over the period, you can see, for example, in the first line here, it says Barry Nical chief. And when Barry Nical was chief, this only is for 5 months. Oops, sorry, let me go back there. This is the pay for only 5 months worth, and that would be because the elections were halfway through the year, probably, is my guess. And so here you've got 12 months, 12, oh, maybe that's not why. I'm not sure why that is then. But 12 months, 12 months, 12 months, that's for 1 year. So Elgin would have been, I'm guessing, an employee as well as being a counselor during these years because his amount's way higher. And then for people who are just doing their council duties, they're looking at $12,750 per year that they're getting paid to do the work. There's one kind of outlier, which is this amount here, $440,000. And that says to Desmond McKinnon. And I asked somebody about that because I thought maybe it might be a typo. And they said they thought it was correct because it has to do with a major, I think they might have said logging contract, some big contract. So that they had through their business. And so again, like down here, Averill Jack, you can see the numbers higher. This would include salary. So it looks like around $70,000 maybe, something like that. And this number here as well being bigger. So the numbers are all over the map because it's not just the money they get for being on chief and council. So now let's look at some other jurisdictions and how did they decide their amounts. Right now I don't know what the process is. I think the chief and council just get paid whatever the government gives in the funding agreement. But how do other areas do this? When you're looking at provincial elected officials, what they get is a basic compensation. And this is a slide I made about 6 months ago, so I'm not sure if this has changed since the new government has been in, but this is as of 6 months ago anyways, that they get $119,532 basic compensation for the year. And then they also get mandatory CPP tax and benefit plan deductions. So basically, Canadian pension plan, income tax, and money that gets contributed towards their health and dental, for example, benefits get taken off of that $119,000 a year before they get anything. Members of the Legislative Assembly are not allowed to pay into the federal EI program, employment insurance program. So they can't collect EI once they're done their jobs, once their term ends. They also get additional salaries if they get appointed to specific offices within government. So if they are the premier, they get an additional $107,000. If they are appointed as a minister to be responsible for example, Minister of Lands, Minister of Agriculture, etc., they get an additional just about $60,000. And then there's all sorts of other kind of smaller positions that they might get an appointment to that they would get additional money for example, being the Speaker of the House or having other duties and responsibilities on top of their ministerial duties. In addition to this, they would get a capital city living allowance if they do not live within the Greater Victoria area. And this is to assist them in costs of maintaining a second home. And the maximum they're allowed to ask for reimbursement of under this living allowance is $25,000 per year. And that money can go towards things like renting a second home down in Victoria so that they can attend meetings down here. It could go towards travel down here. Down to Greater Victoria. And then no matter what, there's that maximum cap on how much it can be. And then there's deductions that happen. So off the top of their pay as basic compensation, money can be taken off. And so if they're more than 10 days, they are absent from attending legislature, house or committee meetings that they're responsible for, then they get $300 deduction from their basic compensation for the days that they miss. So it would be that $120,000 minus $300 for meetings missed, etc. They could also claim additional meal costs. So this is kind of like a travel allowance. If they're more than 50 kilometers away from home to conduct their business, then they can get up to $61 a day for their meals and incidentals. In terms of how the money is managed, the Legislative Assembly has a management committee, and that management committee makes policies around how they're going to administer money to the MLAs. And they also look at all the expenses. So there's estimates of expenditures for MLAs, and they approve those estimates of expenditures and make forecasts and analyze how much it's going to cost per year for the MLAs for different things. They're responsible for paying the capital city allowance to members. So that's that kind of living away from home type allowance that I talked about, up to $25,000. They make payments to members of the Legislative Assembly for any expenses that they incur as part of their performance of their duties. So for example, maybe they have to pay parking to attend an event that the government has asked them to attend. That might be an example. They also are responsible for making payments to constituent offices for operational matters. So when you're elected as a member of Legislative Assembly, you will have an office in the riding or the area, the district that you're elected in to represent. And that would be your constituent office, and operational matters includes things like the rent for that office space, for example. And then the Legislative Assembly Management Committee can also establish severance plans and pay severance to people who basically retire as MLAs. So one of the things to ask is there anything from a Wet'suwet'en perspective that comes into play when we're looking at how we, I guess, honor or show respect for the work of the chief and council, right? How do we recognize and honor the time of our leaders for the work that they do on our behalf as Wet'suwet'en people? And thinking about whether there's any stories, histories, specific words in the Wet'suwet'en language, specific Wet'suwet'en laws that you are familiar with, or oral traditions that you are familiar with that talk about how we recognize and honor the time of our leaders for the work that they do on behalf of us, right? So what can you think of in this regard, and how can that inform what you want to see in the custom election code at the end of the day? And then the next thing to think about is around the types of remuneration or pay or compensation, whatever you want to call it, honorarium, that a chief or councillor should be eligible to receive. Should they have a basic amount that covers kind of a set list of basic duties that they have, and it's paid? So right now it's a monthly honorarium. So should it just be a regular annual honorarium split up over 12 months that, you know, as long as you're doing your duties, you get paid it? Or should it be changed to something like it's based on the amount of time that you spend on duties? And one thing I hear from lots of communities is that there's a lot of variation in the amount of time chiefs and councillors spend on their duties. Should it be an hourly amount? If somebody is holding a portfolio, should they get an additional amount, similar to how you would if you were an MLA and you were also appointed as a minister? And what types of expenses should be reimbursed? So the first thing is around the types of money that or compensation that a chief or councillor should be eligible for. And the second piece is around who should be responsible for setting the amount of that compensation. So if, for example, the type of compensation you decide is appropriate is a monthly per diem or monthly honorarium, then who sets the amount of that monthly honorarium, right? And should that be, there's some ideas I had here, maybe having the finance committee make the final decision during the time that they recommend the annual budget to chief and council for approval. And the council member who's on the finance committee would step away from that decision. They would declare themselves in a conflict of interest while the rest of the committee makes the decision. Should there be an independent council management committee similar to the Legislative Assembly Management Committee that's appointed by maybe the Finance Committee to make these decisions, or is there some other way that this type of a decision should be made? And this is the end of the slides for our conversation, so I'm going to stop sharing and then we'll jump into conversation.